Okay.
Go for it.
Instead of one person preaching today, there are three. It's called Squad Preach. It's very exciting. We get to hear three different perspectives of the same brilliant verse, chapters, verse, all of it. It's John. So our three wonderful people today are going to come up one at a time. They're going to preach for about 5 to 7 minutes each, and it's going to be great. I think to cheer them all on, because they're all a little bit nervous, it would be really nice if we could go against the rules of church and clap for each person when they come up. Give them a big cheer, make them feel super welcome.
John 6, chapters 16 to 24. Okay, that evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake toward Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them and the sea grew very rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat. They were terrified, but he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I am here." Then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the far shore saw that the disciples had taken the only boat, and they realized Jesus had gone with them. Several boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the Lord had blessed the bread and the people had eaten. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into their boats and went across to Capernaum to look for him. And I think Sarah Barton is our first squad preacher. Let's give her a round of applause.
Good morning. Right, well, when I read this, and in fact I also read it from the New Living Translation, the one word that stuck out to me was wait. In that beginning sentence, it says, that evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm not patient, and I don't like waiting. If I have ordered something, I expect it to come the next day. If I'm waiting for a letter, I want it to come soon. If I've asked a question, whether it's to God or someone else, I want the answer, particularly to God, and I want the answer now. I don't like waiting. And yet in this passage, we have the disciples who have just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people. And then it said that Jesus slipped away into the hills by himself. And the disciples were waiting on the shore. Now, I don't know about you, but I imagine they were on a real high. They had seen this most amazing miracle of Jesus feeding all these people. And I wondered what they were talking about. I wonder if they were wondering what was going to happen next. And it just must have been a real buzz. But they had to be patient, and they had to wait. Sometimes waiting can paralyze us. It depends what we're waiting for. It may be that you're waiting for a big decision you've got to make and you don't know what to do. It could be that you're waiting for some results. And that can be absolutely paralyzing, and you don't know what to do, where to turn, and you are just frozen. In Psalm 27, verse 14, it says, wait patiently for the Lord. Be brave and courageous. And again, yes, wait patiently for the Lord. So as I've already said, this is something that I need to learn, and I'm still learning it. And yet in the Bible, we see that there are some people who had to wait patiently. They were told through either anointing or through dreams what God wanted them to do. And yet they had to wait years before they walked into their full potential. People like Joseph, David, and Paul. Joseph, as some of you would know, was a young man. He had a dream. He told his brother about his dream, how they were going to have to bow down to him, and they got rid of him. They sold him into slavery. And then he worked in Potiphar's house, and in the Bible it says the Lord was with Joseph. But it's not happened yet. God had told him he was going to do this, and yet Joseph still had to wait patiently and trust in God. And eventually, after he had interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he was then made ruler of Egypt. God still used him, even while he was waiting. God wants to use all of us. And sometimes when we have to wait, we do have to trust God and know that he's doing a work in us. But it is not always easy. 7 years ago, Paul and I decided that we would downsize from our house in Plymouth, where we had lived for 30 years, and move nearer our 3 daughters and their families. 1 daughter lives in Wantage, 1 in Cardiff, and 1 in Lincoln. So not really an easy place to find living near all of them. We had a big area, and we got some friends and family to pray so that we would know where we would live. Eventually, we found a house in Blunsdon. I'd managed also to find a job in a school in Swindon. I'm a TA. Great, all systems go. The removal vans were ready and they knew when they were coming. A week before we were due to move, we went to sign all the contracts and everything, and the people we were buying off said they wouldn't sign the contracts as they hadn't found a house yet. Yeah, that was a biggie. And I remember Paul and I walking out from the solicitors going, well, what the heck do we do now? Where do we go? This is what we thought God was saying. Our daughter said, sell your house. Come and live with us. So Paul went to Cardiff. I stayed with our daughter in Wantage and commuted every day to Swindon. We continued to look and push doors. And I think it was probably one of the hardest times that we had done. Paul did most of the legwork. He did a lot of looking at houses and finding out when we could go. But there just seemed to be nothing coming. And one morning on my drive, I very much talk to God when I'm driving, and he does know he knew how I was feeling at that point. And as I passed, I can't tell you where it is. All I know is it's from Wantage to Cardiff. You see these big wind turbines on the hill, and it was a foggy day. And one day, the fog was starting to lift so you could see the turbines. And I really felt God saying, you will know soon where you're going to live. Now, I just cried first the way to Swindon, and then when I got to the car park in school, I had to ring Paul and tell him. We eventually did find a bungalow in Hayden Wick. This was a time of waiting, and it was hard, and there was lots of questioning. It can be a scary and a lonely place. And it's hard sometimes when you pray in that place. I don't know about you, but I find it hard sometimes to concentrate. It will be, what have I got to do next? Have I put the washing on? Is the dog out? Things like that. So for me personally, when I'm in that place or when I'm praying, I find it hard I find it easy if I picture myself doing something. My 2 things that I use either is I'm sitting on a big flat rock by a river in a place called Shaw Prior, which is in Devon. And it is just very peaceful. And I can either be just sitting there and just being still, or I can just sit and chat to God. The other picture that I find helpful is, I don't know if any of you have seen Evan Almighty, but at the end of the film, Evan is walking up the hill, and at the top of the hill is a tree. And there is God standing, smiling at him. I will walk up that hill, and I will sit under that tree with God. And then he and I will either just sit, or we will talk, and I can then listen. But these times can also sometimes be lonely, and you do need a friend, someone who you trust, who will stand with you while you wait and support you and also hear what God is saying. And my one plea is that if any of you are going through a hard time at the moment and you don't have anyone who can stand with you, please see one of the team here, because we would love to stand with you at this time. Thank you.
Do you know, it's actually really quite exciting to be standing here. 2 weeks ago, Paul shared a bit of the story of the Well Church, beginning with Launch Sunday just 20 weeks ago, and the sending out from Patton Church, which had planted 3 years previous. But my journey with the Well starts way, way before that. 5, maybe even 6 years ago, I sat in a meeting room whilst I was working for the diocese, sat in a meeting room with Joel Sales in Swindon, before he'd even been appointed to be a vicar in Swindon, and we were putting together a proposal for what could be. So I had to say to Joel, well, let's imagine you've been called to Swindon, and let's imagine we can find a building that could be a church, and let's imagine we can find some funding for that, and let's imagine you're leading that church, and that church is growing, and 3 years in, the time comes to plant. Where on this map do you think that church could plant? And we prayed and we drew a big circle around the 40,000 people living in North Swindon. And that went into the proposal. And here we are, actual people in an actual place, worshipping Jesus and building community. And it's flipping exciting to be a part of, because way back then I had no idea that I'd be stood here today or that this would be happening. God is part of the journey, and sometimes the journey feels long. But anyway, I received this morning's passage from Paul and looked it up over breakfast and thought, yeah, that's fine. I know that one. That's okay. And then I looked again and I realized this isn't the boat story where Jesus is walking on the water and the disciples are in the boat and Jesus calls Peter to get out of the boat and to walk on water with him. Peter comes willingly. He's walking on the water. He's doing it. But then he loses faith and begins to sink. Me, on the other hand, I'm firmly rooted in the boat. I'm happy in my comfort zone. I'm not getting out. This also isn't the boat story where the disciples are in the boat fishing and Jesus is on the shore. They haven't caught any fish, and Jesus is shouting out to them and saying, look, try casting your nets on the other side of the boat. It's okay, Jesus. We're fishermen. We've got this. We know what we're doing. But in the end, they relent and they throw their nets on the other side of the boat. And they catch so many fish. Whereas me, I'm sat in the boat. I'm quite happy. I know what I'm doing. I'm kind of resisting the change that Jesus is urging me to make. I quite like it fishing on this side of the boat, Jesus. It's not that boat story. And it's also not the boat story where Jesus meets James and John for the first time. They're both fishermen. They're on the shore. They're fixing their nets. And Jesus calls them to leave their boat behind and follow him. James and John instantly do. They drop everything. They leave their livelihoods behind and they follow Jesus into the unknown. Whereas me, I want to take some time to weigh up the pros and cons of any big life decision like that. I'm not going to act too hastily in any big decision. This is the boat story of Jesus walking out on the water and getting into our boats, joining us where we are in our boats. It isn't get out of the boat or change what you're doing or leave the boat behind. This is Jesus getting into your boat. So the question is, what does your boat look like? Now, I'm not a great fan of water. I'm not dirty, but I just don't like swimming or the possibility of falling in and getting wet or puddles for that matter. So it's rare to find me in a boat, but 2021 did feature 3 boats for me. First of all, there was the Flamingo Pedalo in Lechlade. I don't know if you've done that, but we did that, on the hottest day of last year. It's hard work, but there's no chance of sinking, and we did look a little bit silly, I guess, but we weren't going to get wet. There was the rowing boat in the Lake District, where our kids tried the walking on water thing, and let's just say it's a good job that they were wearing life jackets, because they found that a bit tricky. But equally, no storms that day. We survived. And then there was the canoe with family down the River Wye in the summer, where we first had to sit through a 30-minute safety briefing, just in case anything untoward did happen. And my nephew spent a good chunk of that day. His dad works for a Formula One team, so he spent a lot of the day just announcing to the peaceful surroundings how bored he was because of how slow we were travelling. So I wonder, what does your boat look like right now? Because if your boat's a dinghy with holes in it and it feels like it's sinking, Jesus gets in. And if your boat is a rowing boat and you're struggling against the current and you're paddling upstream, then Jesus gets in. And if your boat is a sailboat battling against the storm, being tossed this way and that way, then Jesus gets in. But I wonder, what if your boat's more like one of the luxury super yachts on the TV series Below Deck? Is that a guilty TV pleasure for anyone? Some knowing laughs. Perhaps your boat is just pretty normal. Perhaps you're doing okay and you're not facing any big struggles or difficulties or challenges. Like my 2021 boat experiences, you're not sinking or battling upstream or battling a storm. Perhaps, like me, you're really glad that Jesus does get into our boats when we're facing struggles, does save us from maritime difficulty. But if life's okay, if your boat is seaworthy and there isn't a storm, Jesus still gets in and meets you there. So whatever your boat situation this morning, Jesus is walking out on the water towards you and offering to get into your boat. And the question is, are you going to invite him aboard? Rachel.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you. So as I've been thinking over the last few weeks about what I should speak about this morning, my mind has kept coming back to the disciples in the boat. So, I wonder, what was that situation like for them? What were they thinking? How were they feeling? And I've been fortunate enough so far in my life to have had limited experience of difficult boat journeys. And the experience I do have is quite lighthearted. And I don't think Andy will thank me for sharing this story. But a few years ago, we went to Devon with some friends, and we decided, as you do, that rather than just driving to the local beach, we would kayak from the village across the harbour to the little beaches on the other side. So it all sounded very lovely in theory. And so we arrived, and our friends had these lovely, sit-on sea kayaks, quite streamlined, quite robust. And Andy and I rocked up with our inflatable kayak, which is a bit like a long dinghy, really. So nevertheless, we weren't put off. We were hopeful it would be a good paddle across. But we hadn't long set off before we realised that actually this might not quite be the relaxing paddle experience we were hoping for. We were navigating through quite a lot of sea traffic. So we were in Salcombe. There was a lot of lovely yachts and speedboats that were creating quite a lot of waves. We'd also never paddled through a current before. And then to top it all off, about 5 minutes in, we realised that we'd actually not plugged the bottom of the boat in, which you have to do, it turns out, with inflatable boats. So we'd taken on quite a lot of water, which led to me bailing us out and Andy desperately plugging the bottom of the boat in. So, as you can imagine, it really wasn't the stress-free paddle that we'd imagined that day. And I feel like it's a similar situation, isn't it, that the disciples found themselves in. So this journey really didn't go as they'd maybe planned or expected. I think, firstly, we see that it started much later than they'd anticipated. So they were waiting for Jesus. It had become dark, and actually it was like the middle of the night, and you think possibly the worst time, really, isn't it, to be heading off on a journey like this. They'd spent all day with Jesus, with the crowds he was preaching, and they were probably weary and tired from the day. And then we see that there's this gale that sweeps in, so the wind is picking up, and you imagine that their boat is being steered off course. They're being disorientated, and the waves are getting really choppy, and it's all round, the situation is just not looking good for them. And then we have this brilliant moment where we see that it's into the, the darkness and the disorientation and the struggle for the disciples that Jesus himself arrives. And he doesn't, send manpower. He doesn't send boats to come and help them, or he doesn't try and manage the situation from the shore, which he could have done. But no, Jesus himself comes and stands with them in that storm, and he says these words, "Don't be afraid, I am here." And instantly the situation is changed. The storm seems to just disappear, and they're on the other side. They're where they need to be. And as I sat and thought about this situation for the disciples, I thought, how similar is that to life sometimes? Life can feel like an unexpected journey. And there can be amazing, brilliant moments, can't there? And then there can be times that feel like the struggle of this boat journey for the disciples. I think that just as the disciples' journey started at what seemed to be like an inconvenient time or an unplanned time, I think, so for us, we can expect to be somewhere in life by a certain point, and it doesn't always work out like that, or we can feel like our life is being blown off course and our life is heading in a different direction to what we imagined, and there can be darkness and disorientation for us too. And I think sometimes just the forces around us or even within us can feel overwhelming. And I think that it's into these situations of our lives that Jesus is speaking the same words to us today. Don't be afraid, I am here. And just as Jesus came and stood with the disciples in that storm, Jesus longs to stand with us too in our storms and in the really, good parts of life too. And, all he's asking is for us to invite him in. And I think the greatest example that we have of just how much Jesus longs to be a part of our lives is when he came from heaven to earth to live here, a perfect life, unrecognized, and then to go to the cross to ultimately die for us so we could know his love and his forgiveness and his life to the full for us. And there's a verse in John 10, verse 10 that says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So this morning, even if life is feeling like an unexpected journey, Jesus is just longing that we would invite him in to experience his life for us to the full. And it doesn't necessarily mean that like our problems and our difficulties will instantly disappear, but it does mean that he has promised that he'll be with us and he will help us. And it says in the Bible that, if you're feeling weary or weighed down this morning, then he can be our rest. If you're feeling confused or disorientated with life, then he can give wisdom and knowledge and understanding. If you're feeling crushed in your spirit or brokenhearted, he knows he's close. He knows our sorrows. He keeps track of them. He counts our tears. We can't imagine that kind of care, but that's how much he cares for us. And if we're afraid this morning, then he can be our safe place. He can be our strength. So I wonder this morning, if you've never invited Jesus into your life, maybe today could be the day that you choose to do that and you experience his life for you to the full. And if you are a follower of Jesus this morning, I wonder, I hope that this has just been encouragement for you to keep inviting him into every aspect of your life. And I wonder how we can be doing more of that today. So thank you for listening.